So, Tammy, it's great to be with you again. And I do want to talk about how your team is doing because I think one of the things that we didn't expect because of the pandemic is just the mental toll that it is taking on everyone. And you at Verizon, you folks, your teams have been dealing with this since January of this year because you have operations customers in Asia, in Europe. So, how is your team doing? Because I think when we talked last week, you said we're tired, but we're resilient.
Yeah, I think that's a good framing for it as I think about where we are almost a year into this crisis. What started as I think, a physical health crisis, I think is increasingly becoming a mental health crisis for all of us
Yeah.
as we think about kind of the duration of the COVID crisis and the uncertainty of how long it continues for. I think about when it first started in the first half of the year, I think we all thought if we can just get to summer, it'll be over. And then I think we thought if we can get through summer and we can get to school, the school year, kids will go back to school. And now we're like, whoa, when does it end? And we've had to really focus our efforts on how do we create a sense of hope? How do we acknowledge the anxiety and stress that people are feeling? And then how do we try to build an environment that allows our employees to do what they do so well, which is create resiliency and I'd be clear on what success looks like so that they can lean in and feel confident that what they're doing is making a difference in defining the purpose of what they do every day.
So, Tammy, how do you do that? Okay, so mental wellness. I know when you and I talked last week, we live in a society as evolved as we are that it's still uncomfortable for a lot of people to say, it's easy for me to say, I've got to go to the doctor, I've got something physically wrong. But when there's something in
Right.
my head that's not quite right, it's hard for us to admit as a society. How do you do it, especially when we can't even talk face to face? We've got to do it virtually. So, how do you keep tabs on your teams that some of the individuals who may be having a tough time?
Yeah, listen, I think it takes a series of things to really open up that dialogue and conversation. You're right. It's not a conversation we want to have in the open. We tend to whisper, like, oh, I think somebody is having a hard time. I
Mhm.
think historically that's how we've dealt with it. And I think that what we're seeing is that we really have to put mental illness, stress, anxiety, suicide, addiction, all of those things into the middle of the table and realize that they impact and affect everybody. And the way that we collectively show up on behalf of how we lift each other up and acknowledge and recognize the stress, care for it, help people get the resources that they need to be successful has been really important. We've actually, in our series of communication that we call Up to Speed, which is how we communicate broadly to our employees around the world. And we open it up, quite frankly, to anyone who wants to participate. But we've done a lot of highlighting of some of the challenges around mental health, around suicide, around domestic violence, around child abuse, around addiction to really say these are real and they're happening in increasing odds because of what we've all been through in the last year. And here are the resources that are available to you and to your family and to the community in which we live. And I think that's so important that we put a
So,
spotlight on it and make it okay to talk about.
So you know too, though, like I work for a great company too, and there's tons of resources. And there's one thing about knowing that there's an array of resources. There's another thing of making sure people kind of reach out and tap into it. So I'm curious whether it's through your line managers, how are you making where somebody says, you seem like you're having a tough time. I want you to, kind of either push them and help them in terms of finding what they need. How do you make
Yeah,
sure
we,
basically
we've
that people who are having a tough time, like tap into the array of resources that you guys are offering up?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question of how do you really make sure it's doing. And I don't know that you always know that it's happening, but I can tell you that some of the framework that we've created has said we've done a quarterly pulse survey. So we've asked our employees directly, how are you feeling? What more do you need from us as an employer to really deal with the crisis that you're in? We've asked managers to then go through that feedback and work an action plan with their team more broadly and with people individually. We've also used our performance management cycle, our quarterly cycle of performance management, to really touch in with employees and say, how are you feeling about your work environment? Thank you for inviting us into your home to work over the last 6 months, because that's really what employees have done. We've found ways to celebrate the kids, the cats, and the dogs that are in the background of the Zoom calls that we're all in. We've tried to ask parents to take some time to help educate their kids when they get up and get started in the morning. And so we've really worked to try to create that one-to-one relationship, the team relationship, and then a broader framework of the tools that are available. You only know that if you ask the question. And we've created a dialogue of uncomfortable conversations for the purpose of getting comfortable, that our employees have what they need to really feel successful.
In terms of levels of stress, Tami, are you seeing it? Is it people who are single living alone? Is it parents who've got young kids and they're schooling at home? Is it kind of across the board?
Yes, yes, and yes. It really is all of those circumstances. And I think it is, I think in many cases, the isolation and the loneliness has been one that we've really asked our employees to reach out to people that you haven't talked to in a while. Talk to a friend. If you've missed talking to a coworker and you don't see them in the hallways the way you used to, you don't see them in the Starbucks line, pick up the phone and call them. Drop them a note. Let them know you care. Because I think those are the isolated situations. On the other hand, one of the things that we know is that moms and women in particular are falling out of the workforce faster than they ever have before. And it is because they feel the responsibility of being the CEO of their home. Plus, they're trying to manage their career, and that's been overwhelming. So, I think it varies by employee depending on what their personal circumstances are, which means that the tools in which you serve those communities have to vary as well.
One thing I thought was really interesting that you said that I think you were encouraging your line managers and your team to do is that when you do have a call, right, we're all going, I mean, I literally had 4 Zoom calls yesterday. It was just back to back. But when you have those calls and you're with a group of people, it's not just, okay, here's what we're working on, for the company, but you start with, okay, so what's going on in your life? And,
Yeah,
and you kind of
yeah.
let everybody have a chance and everybody's got to answer, how you doing?
Yeah, we've actually adopted something that has been really effective. We started just before the crisis, so the timing was good. But we call it a personal professional check-in. Tell me how you're doing personally, and tell me how you're doing professionally. So, what are the things that you are excited about, or sad about, or thrilled about, or worried about from both a personal and a professional standpoint? And what we found is it allows us to build history together as a team. It allows us to celebrate wins together. It allows us to acknowledge a loss. It allows us to open up and have a conversation amongst people who care for people, as opposed to simply people that are on the same team. We've also done some kind of dorky things like everybody sings happy birthday when somebody has a birthday. Try singing happy birthday on Zoom. It's the worst happy birthday rendition you'll ever hear, but everybody laughs. So there's some degree of humor and levity and humanness to how we show up.
What's interesting is, and I know you feel this way, that it is such an important conversation to have. You reminded me that in, the peaks of the virus here in New York City, we had an emergency room doctor who committed suicide because
Mhm.
they didn't feel comfortable enough to reach out to someone and they were feeling stressed. And you do wonder, these are important conversations and we need to make sure that we tap into our teams and colleagues who might be struggling and are afraid to admit it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example of somebody who was such an accomplished woman who everyone thought had everything put together. And the reality is, the
Yeah.
world didn't give her permission to say, I need some help. I grew up in a medical home. My father was a physician, my mother was a nurse, my siblings are all in healthcare industry. And somehow we set that group of workers in a different pedestal and say, you can't have the kind of health problems that others have. I love that her family to really remember her as putting a lot of legislation forward to acknowledge and recognize that healthcare workers, as much as anybody, are going to deal with some of those issues because of PTSD. They see it every day. Imagine what healthcare workers have seen over the last 6 months. They have oftentimes
Yeah.
been the one with patient, the one with family, the one with the ecosystem when death and dying is happening. What a terrible, terrible place to be. And yet they've done it with grace and just been so calm and kind in the process. I think about our own world and the ability to raise a hand and say, I need help. I look at my environment right now. I'm working harder and faster and longer days than I ever have before. And I think so many of my employees fit into that same situation, because you are really building the business of today while you plan for the business of tomorrow, and you're dealing with the crisis at the same time. So I think corporations have to play a bigger role in framing up options for care and options to admit that we need a little bit of time and a little bit of help.
Well, in keeping with that, because, some of the stress, some of the mental well-being is because of these additional stresses. We could go to work and kind of leave them at home, or the kids were at school and you kind of got a break, right? I mean, work
Yeah.
can often be a haven. I am curious about what new policies you guys have put in place to maybe help people, whether it's taking care of, kids, whether it's taking care of elderly. What have you had to change from the existing policies pre-COVID?
Yeah, we've done a number of things around care leaves that we think are really important. And I think it's just, if I step back for a minute to January, one of the things that we did early in January is to say we need to be very clear on the priorities that will govern how we react to this crisis. And we started with the expectation that employee safety had to be our first priority. From there, then we recognize the obligation to serve customers, the responsibility we have to shareholders, and then a broader responsibility to society at large, recognizing that that really is our fourth stakeholder. We identified early a caregiver leave that said if you need to take time to care for yourself, or to care for a child, or to care for a family member, do so. We also really broadened out the category of what qualifies as a caregiver. So we had a lot of kids that were
Mhm.
home for the summer from college that qualified as a caregiver, that's the way they made money taking care of kids. That's a great way to bring in the entire family ecosystem, or your next door neighbor who was laid off, who doesn't have a job, that can be your caregiver. So trying to be as creative as possible with how we created the capacity for caregiving for our employees, and acknowledging that in some cases you're going to say that resource enough alone is not enough. I need to take
Right.
some time, and great, go ahead and do it. We've also really
Do you say
encouraged
that? Will you say
vacation.
that to workers? And will you say, listen,
Absolutely.
tell you need to take a long weekend, or you need to take a week, or do you do that, or have you done that?
Yeah, yeah, we've not only done it, but I've had to model it myself, because if I don't do it myself, my employees don't
Hmm.
actually believe they can do it. And so, I'll use Hans Vesper, who's our CEO, as a great example. He went to Sweden for a week and was on vacation, and he made it a point to make sure the world knew he was on vacation. Why? Because it reinforced, it set the tone at the top that said, we all need a break from what we're doing. And so I really applaud that. So I think as leaders, not only do our actions have to be consistent with our words, we need to encourage people to take the time. I've had employees that call in on a call. I know they're on vacation, and I've asked them to go back to their vacation and leave the call to us. We've got it.
So we're dealing with the health pandemic that creates stresses on our mental well-being, and then of course what happened in Minneapolis and George Floyd and some
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
Black Americans. So dual pandemics. So how have you dealt with that within Verizon, specifically, race and even politics, which has created, another bunch of layers of stress on all of us?
Yeah, the year that we have seen in 2020 has been one that we'll never forget, as you think about not only the healthcare crisis, but then the tragic murder of George Floyd, and then the economic fallout, and then the political cycle that we're living in. And I think about specifically with the racial and social justice conversation. Verizon has always had a very strong regard for and engagement with diversity and inclusion, but the way we talk about racial justice has changed radically as a result of what we saw play out this summer. I recall very distinctly the murder of George Floyd, and that following Monday, when our CEO took a very strong and very emotional position in front of the world that said, we can no longer tolerate this kind of racial injustice anywhere in the world. And if we're going to move the world forward in the way that we expect to at Verizon, we have to play a key role in how we show up on behalf of putting a spotlight on racial injustice and taking action to make sure that we really take this moment and turn it into a movement. We initiated a $10 million grant to many of the organizations that are working on the issue today. But that was really just the starting point, because what we've seen is that our employees, regardless of whether they're Black or white or male or female or young or old, they want to be part of this conversation. And it is the conversations that are really powerful when you can say, how does it feel in your world? And what can I do to make you feel like you belong at Verizon? What are the things that, when you come into the work environment, what can I do to make you feel like you belong? And I think that's the conversation that is shifting. It's no longer enough to have representation. You actually have
Right.
to feel like you belong when you come into the work environment.
What you just said about, what you said about Hans, your CEO, taking a vacation, leadership at this time, what you do really sets an example. And I think about, we have a question coming in from the audience about, people being tied to their devices, right? On your phone nonstop. How do you make people log off? How do you, like Hans, say, I'm on vacation, or I'm putting my phone down, folks. You can't reach me for the rest of the night. What's the strategy to get people to do something like that?
Yeah, that phone is one that we're all fairly addicted to, truth be told.
Yeah.
I think it can serve as such a great source of communication and information for all of us to stay connected, but it can also serve as an inability to put things down and to be. I'm not the best role model at that. Admittedly, I would tell you that I get pretty connected to that device, although I do try really hard when I'm driving. It goes in my trunk so that it's not out in a distraction when I'm driving. That's kind of my safe space. But I think we've all got to remind ourselves to do more of that, to be able to put it away and to say it's okay to take some downtime. You go to a restaurant and you see everybody on a phone as opposed to actually engaging in the conversation. And so it's one I think we're going to need to work at. I think some of the things that Apple has done with their devices in terms of reminding us each how much time we spend every week on our devices is a starting point.
And forgive me, because I feel like I moved off of diversity and inclusion too quickly, because I think it's so important. And you got really real with me on the phone last week, and you said to me, I think when it comes to D&I, diversity and inclusion, I think we have a lot to do here, and that we were somewhat lulled into thinking representation meant diversity. That kind of blew my mind. That's a big thought.
And I think it is that we get comfortable in our conversation around diversity. Do we have the right representation at the table? Do our numbers reflect that we have a diverse workforce? And I would argue that that is just the starting point. We now have to say, do people feel like they're included? And do they feel like they belong in their authentic version of who they are? That's really the conversation we're having at Verizon. As I've thought about my engagement, I happen to have a very diverse set of employees at my table. But the question is, do they all feel as though they belong? Do they feel like they have equal weight in their voice when they're talking about issues? It's my job as a leader to recognize that we all have unconscious biases in the world, but I have to own that. I have to be consciously aware of how I show up. And, one of the examples I've used, because it's been really personal for me, when the George Floyd situation happened, I was talking to one of my colleagues who happens to be a Black female, and she's exceptionally good at what she does. And we were working through kind of business continuity, disaster recovery planning after what was happening in Minneapolis. And I realized at the end of the conversation that I had gone through all the administrative work of, do we have a plan? But I hadn't stopped to say, and how are you feeling about what's happening in your community? And I called her back and I said, I owe you an apology, because I got so caught up in business that I forgot to pause and say, how does the person feel? How do you, as my coworker, as my friend, as a Black female feel? And what can I do differently?
Well, and I do wonder, and I think we've certainly had these conversations. I mean, what's it like? And I'm curious if you guys have been asking, what's it like to be a Black employee at Verizon?
We've actually absolutely asked that question. And I've had the benefit, I've got a group of 20 employees that are all levels of employees within the organization around the globe that are Black employees that have come together. And I've said, would you give me feedback on what it's like to be a Black employee at Verizon? What do you need from me? What can we do differently? How does your world feel as a Black employee at Verizon? And I'm now in my third session with them, because we've become friends and colleagues with a common purpose, which is we all want to feel like we belong. We want to understand each other's world. And they've been very generous and open in terms of what it feels like to be a Black employee at Verizon and what more we can collectively do to all feel like we belong. And I think those are the uncomfortable conversations we all have to have if we're going to get good at doing the things that will really take this from a moment in time to a movement that will deliver, sustainable change.
We started talking about, and we've continued to kind of weave it through, the importance of mental wellness. And I do wonder if your minority employees at Verizon, Tami, have felt kind of more at risk when it comes to burnout, because, we know when it comes to COVID that they are more at risk. We know that certainly what happened to George Floyd and other Black Americans in this country resonate with them differently than you or I. So I do wonder if you've thought about that as a manager.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly they feel a different level of stress, even in the conversation of the fact that race is being talked about around the environment. They feel a sense of awareness and engagement and personalization that the rest of us may not feel because it's exhausting to share stories that perhaps they've never shared in the work environment. And so for them, it's about exposing a piece of who they are at the same time as they're going through the same kind of waves of disappointment that we all are with COVID, whether it's, loss of a milestone moment, and then they're now dealing with this on top of, they may have economic components that are impacting their community. And so I think undoubtedly they are, which is why we've really got to wrap our arms around one another, lift each other up and say, we will get through this together.
One thing that really I just want to get to is that you mentioned to me that 35% of your workers don't know about their purpose or role in the organization, and that you're really trying to tap into that. That's one third of your workers.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you think about that, and at the same time, you're worried about their physical well being, their mental well being, you're telling them, log off, don't worry. But I bet at the same time, workers at home, I've gone through a little bit of this. It's like, what am I missing? Maybe if I'm stepping away because I'm already removed from my office. So, how do you balance all of that?
Yeah, that's that whole FOMA, fear of missing out. I think the thing that's so important on that 35% number is that's a best in class number when we compare ourselves against other organizations. And that best in class number says that you still have about 30 to 35% of your people that don't understand and define their purpose in the organization. We stepped back a year ago and defined our purpose at Verizon. Our purpose is to create the networks that move the world forward. I do think that this crisis environment has caused people to say, being at work is a safe thing to do. I know what success looks like. And so I maybe am working now more than ever before. We're having to say enough's enough. Take a break, take a vacation, be intentional about asking people to schedule that. And again, to model that expectation so that people understand it's okay. And then we've got to help make sure the work gets done somewhere else, because it's one thing to say, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. But when the work just continues to pile up and they come back
Right.
and it's harder than it was before they left, you've got to care for both of those things, not only the employee, but the work that needs to get done.
Just to wrap up, one piece of advice to our audience in terms of leading at this time. You mentioned to me last week that you think COVID's going to be with us for the next year, 18 months. This is about going the distance right now. With your team, its struggles, its successes, in a world that is just not normal. So what last words of advice might you have for our group that's out there about how they can best take care of their teams, their physical as well as their mental well-being at this time?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we remember we are running a marathon and not a sprint. And your employees don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think taking the time to care for people, not only your employee, but the family that surrounds them, will pay back in spades in terms of what that employee can over time contribute to the success of the business. And so demonstrate through your words and your actions that you care about the person that's your employee, and they will forever care about your business.
And I'm just going to share one tip with our audience that you shared with me, is that you've got a list of 300 top employees, and every day you pick up the phone and you call one of them just to touch base.
And you know what I love about it is I used to think, oh, I'm doing something good for my team. Here's what I've learned. It's such a highlight for me because it makes my day richer and better because I hear from somebody I haven't talked to in a while, and I'm reminded that they lift the world and make the world a better place, and it brightens my day. So it's a great part of my day to make that phone call before I wrap the day.